When we study the history of independence in 1822, it's common to imagine that the cry of Ipiranga separated a cohesive and united territory from north to south from the shackles of Portugal.
But what is hardly ever told in the books is that on the other side of the ocean, Angola almost became part of the Empire of Brazil. Deputies even voted in favor of the Union, and the flag of the Empire of Brazil is even said to have been raised in an Angolan city. On paper, the so-called Confederação Brasílica was born, an Angolan movement that did not seek its own independence, but rather to exchange Portuguese rule for that of Brazil. But, after all, why didn't this work out? What made Angola desire Brazil so much instead of Portugal? And what prevented Angola from joining the empire? In today's video, let's reconstruct the history of the Confederação Brasílica and the Atlantic Empire that almost came to be, and understand why Brazil itself hides this very interesting chapter of its own history. But before we start the video, if you like our content, become a member of our channel right now. That way, you'll have access to our group and exclusive content, including live classes, so you can dive even deeper into the behind the scenes of history. To understand how Angola almost became Brazilian, we first need to understand the broad connection between the two sides of the Atlantic. Was Angola the main port for exporting slaves? And was Brazil the largest recipient? But did they also exchange food products produced in Brazil and introduced to Angola, as well as adapted animals and plants? Was Brazilian cassava the basis of Angolan cuisine for a long time? On the other hand, the guinea fowl was perfectly adapted in Brazil, serving both as meat and for controlling small field pests. But this connection wasn't just commercial. In 1648, it was also military. During the Iberian Union, the Dutch declared a full-scale war on the possessions of the Portuguese Empire. After taking Pernambuco, Count João Maurício de Nassau organized expeditions from Recife to conquer the slave ports in Africa precisely to supply Dutch Brazil. And in 1641, he took Luanda. Losing Luanda strangled Brazil. And who solved it? The problem wasn't solved by Lisbon, but by Rio de Janeiro. The so-called Reconquest of Angola was organized by merchants from Rio de Janeiro, led by Governor Salvador Correia de Sá e Sai Benevides. He gathered a fleet of about 15 ships and nearly 2,000 men. And in 1648, this fleet set sail from Guanabara Bay and took Luanda back from the Dutch. Angola was, in practice, reconquered by Brazil for Portugal. And this left lasting marks. As Alan Castro points out, from then on, a good part of the governors of Angola previously held positions in Portuguese America. Born in Brazil, like André Vidal de Negreiros, they became governors of Angola. Salvador Correia de Sá himself did as well. It was almost as if the government of Angola was an appendage of Brazil's government. And that's when the episode that would change everything happened. The arrival of the royal family in Brazil in 1808. As we've already mentioned here on the channel, in 1808, Prince Regent Dom João, fleeing from Napoleon, moved the Portuguese state apparatus to Rio de Janeiro. And overnight, the capital of the empire was no longer Lisbon, but Rio. And in 1815, Brazil was elevated to the status of a kingdom, forming with Portugal the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. And that was decided. Was it decisive for the history of Brazil? Did this territory stop being just a simple province and become a kingdom on equal footing with Portugal? And this in a reality where the entire empire, including Angola, was already governed from Rio de Janeiro. And so the relations between Angola and Brazil, which were already significant, became even more intense? As we've already seen here on the channel, Queen Maria I founded the Luanda School of Medicine and Anatomy in 1789. However, during the crisis surrounding the invasion of Portugal in 1811, Angola was suffering from a lack of doctors. And to make up for this shortage, the government, based in Rio de Janeiro, created a scholarship to bring Angolan students and train them at the Rio de Janeiro School of Medicine, with tickets, accommodation, food, and clothing, all paid by the crown over 5 years. Afterwards, would they return to practice the medical profession in Angola? In other words, everything at that moment revolved around Brazil and the court in Rio de Janeiro. Then, in 1822, with the king's return to Portugal, an unusual proposal from some Brazilian parliamentarians emerged. In a session of the Cortes in Lisbon, in June 1822, the group of Brazilian deputies, led by José Bonifácio's brother, made a bold proposal. Yes, to keep both kingdoms united, but to create two separate congresses, one for Brazil and another for Portugal. And in addition, they also proposed that the provinces of Portuguese Asia and Africa should declare which of the kingdoms they wished to join. In other words, for the first time, Angola would have the formal right to choose between Lisbon and Rio. In this way, in the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves, Angola could be situated in the Kingdom of Brazil instead of the Kingdom of Portugal. And the most impressive thing is that the three deputies elected by Angola to the Cortes weren't even in Lisbon, they were all in Rio de Janeiro. And as Gilberto Giselin's article points out, two of them immediately spoke in favor of Brazil, requesting the incorporation of Angola into that kingdom. That's because the trade and closeness between Angola and Brazil were immense, while with Portugal, it was much less. Only the third deputy was against it, and he was the only deputy who traveled to take office in Lisbon. However, those who most supported the Brazilian side in Angola were precisely the slave-owning elite. That's because the importation of slaves had already been prohibited in Portugal since 1761, with the explicit decree that any enslaved person who arrived at Portuguese ports would be automatically freed. However, in Brazil, this did not exist. In this way, a dispute arose between two cities, Luanda and Benguela. In Luanda, the capital of Angola, the ruling junta was quite friendly toward Brazil. However, the president of the junta was the Portuguese bishop, Friar João Damasceno. And supported by the local Portuguese troops, he managed to prevent Luanda from officially declaring its allegiance to Brazil. And so, as historian Manuel Rebelo points out, he became the most hated man in the city. His portrait was burned, and the ashes of the portrait were thrown into the sea, almost like the ritual punishment of a Judas effigy. In Benguela, in the south, the situation was different. There, the junta was almost entirely pro-Brazil, led by Domingos Pereira de Diniz, described by opponents as that black, ambitious man and the great patron of the union with the Empire of Brazil. Under his command, documents pledging allegiance to Dom Pedro were sent to Rio and published in the Gazeta do Rio, the official newspaper of the Brazilian government, in October 1822. In fact, it is said that when the news of independence arrived, he even raised the flag of the Empire of Brazil at the São Felipe fortress in Angola. In Sumbe and Quicombo, the Brazilian party was also very strong, leading the Angolans to form the so-called Confederação Brasílica, trying to build a movement to join Brazil rather than Portugal. In this way, on both sides of the Atlantic, there were powerful people openly working to turn Angola into an overseas province of Brazil. The historian Eduardo Vera Cruz Pinto, in his article about the Confederação Brasílica, also highlights that in Cabo Verde, there were nativist demonstrations sponsored by Brazilian slaveholders in favor of the Union of Cabo Verde. But Portugal, of course, reacted forcefully. At the end of 1822, the Cortes in Lisbon dismissed the juntas, appointed new administrators, and sent a battalion of more than 400 soldiers to Angola. The new governors reported, alarmed, that there was a large Brazilian party and a very small Portuguese party. Then, decrees were issued to seize the assets of the supporters of the rebel government, and the leaders of these movements were arrested and banished. The merchants of Benguela still plotted the last uprising. They wanted to arrest the governor, break ties with Luanda, and ship everything to Rio, asking Dom Pedro I directly for help. However, the plan was foiled in time by the Portuguese. Meanwhile, in Brazil, Dom Pedro I gave full moral support, published the manifestos, celebrated Benguela's allegiance, but did not send any concrete military support. That's because internally, Pedro needed to suppress uprisings in the provinces that wanted to remain with Portugal, especially Grão-Pará. And finally, because he also ran up against the world's greatest power, England. England, which was leading the end of the transatlantic slave trade, could not allow the biggest buyer and the biggest seller to be under the same government. Would it be something like creating a slave trade superstate? That was one of England's greatest fears. As we've already seen here on the channel, Brazil had a strong shipbuilding industry during the Portuguese period, even building the largest ship in the world in 1663. It had plenty of wood and coastline and was extremely popular among the African slaveholding elites. In this way, England, mediating the Treaty of 1864, made Dom Pedro commit to not accepting proposals from any Portuguese colonies to join the Empire of Brazil. Was this the final nail in the coffin of a possible empire of Brazil and Angola? And then comes the most curious part of all. Was this intense story practically erased from Brazilian books? Is the explanation in the kind of story Brazil decided to tell about itself? Did the empire's official historiography need a myth? Or of a Brazil that was supposedly born already whole, united, and fully formed? And furthermore, one that aimed for independence from an overseas ruling power, not the installation of another over Angola? Add to that the racism and the Eurocentric outlook of the intellectual elite of the time. And that's where all the ironies of this story come together. First, Brazil, this province that had just gained its independence, was about to become a colonizer itself, inheriting the African colony and becoming an empire on both sides of the Atlantic. Second, the other recurring link was the slave trade that bound Angola to Brazil for 2 centuries. And it was precisely this same trade that prevented the Union because England would never allow the largest source and the largest market for captives in the Atlantic to be in a single country. So, what united Angola and Brazil was, in the end, what separated them. And there's an almost perfect final irony. One of the deputies who voted to unite Angola with Brazil by connecting the slave trade networks was named Eusebio de Queiroz. A few decades later, it would be his son with the same name who would give his name to the law that in 1850 would finally put an end to the slave trade in Brazil. And finally, Angola and Brazil would follow separate paths. Few people imagine that between 1822 and 1825, the two came much closer than history usually suggests, to becoming a single country on both sides of the same Atlantic Ocean. If it had worked out, maybe Luanda and Benguela would be cities connected to Brazil today. And that probably would have changed the history of the world forever. And did you know that Angola almost joined the Empire of Brazil? Did you imagine that it was Brazil who reconquered Angola from the Dutch? What surprised you the most? So leave your comment right now to support our work and take the opportunity to become a member of the channel. That way, you'll be able to dive deeper and learn even more about the fascinating Iberian history.